There is a particular discomfort that arises when a beginning feels too complete. When a civilization steps into view already fluent in symbols, already counting the stars, already speaking of laws, duties, and gods with the confidence of long familiarity. Ancient Sumer appears in history like this, without hesitation, without visible preparation, without the clumsy uncertainty one would expect from a true first attempt. And in that smooth arrival, something feels missing. Not broken, not destroyed, simply absent. What if the silence before Sumer is not empty at all, but sealed? And, before you allow your body to sink fully into this stillness, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if there is something in these words that makes you want to remain here a little longer. If you wish, you may also share the place and time where you are listening. I'm always curious about the scattered points of light drifting together through the same night. The Sumerians never described themselves as the first humans, nor their cities as the first attempted order. Their texts do not celebrate discovery in the way later civilizations would. Instead, they speak with the tone of inheritance. Their writing feels less like invention and more like recollection. Laws are restored, not created. Temples are rebuilt, not conceived. Knowledge is passed down, not found. Even the gods arrive with histories already behind them. This alone should slow us down. In the earliest cuneiform records, the Anunnaki do not emerge from the void. They descend, they assemble, they take up roles within a structure that already exists, fractured and unstable. The language is careful but consistent. Authority is transferred, domains are reassigned, boundaries are redrawn. This is not the poetry of Genesis. It is the paperwork of recovery. If something required restoring, then something must have been lost. The Sumerian worldview is saturated with memory, but it is a memory of interruption. Time is not a clean river flowing forward. It is segmented, broken, reset. The gods argue not over creation, but over control, over responsibility, over who must govern the sky, who must hold the earth, who must descend into the depths to manage what cannot be seen. Their disputes feel less mythic than administrative, as if they are responding to a prior catastrophe whose details no longer survive intact. One of the most unsettling elements of Sumerian tradition is the king list. It opens with rulers whose reigns stretch impossibly long, tens of thousands of years, followed by a single, devastating event, a flood. After this line is crossed, everything changes. Kingship becomes mortal, lifespans shrink, memory contracts, civilization continues, but something fundamental is gone. This is often explained away as symbolism, but symbolism itself does not appear without reason. Cultures invent symbols to gesture toward things they cannot say plainly. Trauma does this, loss does this, especially loss that occurred so long ago that only its outline remains. Geology whispers alongside the myths. The end of the last ice age was not gentle. Sea levels rose violently. Coastlines vanished. Entire ecosystems collapsed within generations. Human populations were displaced, fragmented, or erased. If advanced societies existed in vulnerable regions, their remains would now lie beneath oceans or deep sediment, unreachable without intention. And intention for much of modern history has been selective. Excavations in Mesopotamia reach astonishing complexity very quickly. Urban planning, irrigation, trade networks, astronomy, mathematics. These appear with startling speed. Beneath these layers, however, archaeology often falls silent. Not gradually, abruptly. The expected trail of development simply stops. As if someone closed a book and began another, using fragments of the first as reference. This absence does not prove a lost civilization. but repeated absences, clustered in the same places, surrounding the same questions, deserve attention. Silence is a kind of data, especially when it appears precisely where continuity should exist. The Anunnaki in this light no longer feel like distant creators shaping humanity from nothing. They resemble custodians arriving after collapse, figures burdened not with the joy of beginning, but with the obligation of repair. Their authority is heavy, their presence is corrective. They impose order not because they desire it, but because disorder has already proven catastrophic. Sumerian myths rarely dwell on hope. They dwell on balance, on appeasement, on the careful maintenance of fragile systems. Floods are remembered, famines are anticipated, the gods are unpredictable, not benevolent. This is the worldview of a culture that knows how easily stability can vanish. Perhaps this is why Sumerian texts feel haunted. They do not invite the future with optimism, they brace for it. When later civilizations borrowed from Sumer, they inherited the surface, writing, law, cosmology, but often lost the unease beneath it, the sense that history had already ended once before, that progress was not guaranteed, that memory itself could fracture under enough pressure. If Sumer was not the beginning, but a recovery, then the true origin of human civilization may lie far deeper than we are comfortable admitting, deeper than our timelines, deeper than our institutions of knowledge, possibly deeper than what we are prepared to excavate. And if something existed before the Anunnaki, something vast enough to leave only shadows in myth and silence in the soil, then the question is not why it disappeared, but why its disappearance was allowed to become normal. History is not only written by victors, sometimes it is written by survivors who no longer have the words for what they endured. The clay tablets wait patiently, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have already said all they can. What remains is not an answer, but attention, a quiet pressure beneath the story we tell ourselves about beginnings. And if the first civilization we remember was already living after the end of something else, then the line we call history may be less a starting point and more a scar. What then lies on the other side of that scar, still buried, still unnamed, still shaping the present from beneath the surface of what we think we know? The unease does not end with silence in the soil. It deepens when one begins to listen closely to the language itself, not the myths as stories, but the grammar beneath them, the way time is handled, the way succession is implied rather than explained, the way certain words seem to point backward, not toward an origin, but toward something already completed. Sumerian is an ancient language, but it does not behave like a young one. Its structure is dense, compact, already layered with abstraction. Concepts such as authority, destiny, divine decree, and cosmic order are not slowly assembled across centuries of use. They arrive already stabilized. The words do not feel experimental, they feel inherited. There are terms in the earliest tablets that describe replacement rather than creation. Kingship is said to be transferred. Temples are said to be restored. Cities are described as re-established after abandonment. Even the relationship between gods and humans is framed as renegotiation, not a first encounter. The tone suggests continuity interrupted, not continuity begun. Linguists often describe Sumerian as an isolate, a language with no known relatives. This fact is usually treated as a curiosity, a puzzle of classification. But isolation is not neutral. A language becomes isolated either because it emerged alone, or because everything around it vanished. The second possibility is less comfortable, and therefore less explored. Some Sumerian words resist etymology entirely. They do not decompose into smaller roots. They stand whole, opaque, as if lifted from an earlier linguistic environment that no longer exists. These words tend to cluster around foundational ideas: governance, ritual purity, cosmic boundaries, and divine law. It is as though the language itself remembers concepts older than its own speakers. Time, in these texts, behaves strangely. Events are described not as unfolding, but as returning. Cycles dominate narrative flow. Catastrophe is never final, it is recurrent. Order is always provisional. The future is something to be managed carefully, not anticipated with hope. This worldview does not come from innocence. It comes from experience. The Anunnaki within this linguistic frame are not origin points. They are agents within a timeline that already carries scars. Their arrival is described with verbs that imply motion from elsewhere, not emergence from nothing. They take positions, assign functions, impose measures. These are actions taken after instability, not before existence. One begins to notice that the deepest past in Sumerian text is never described directly. It is approached obliquely through references to what followed it. The flood is a dividing line, not a story of beginnings. What matters is not how the world was made, but how it had to be reorganized afterward. Memory stops at the moment of collapse. This pattern appears again and again. When something cannot be remembered clearly, it is often ritualized instead. The Sumerians performed ceremonies not to celebrate origins, but to maintain equilibrium. Their prayers ask for stability, protection, and continuation. Rarely do they ask for novelty. The gods are feared not because they are unknown, but because they are remembered as having witnessed something terrible. In later civilizations, myths tend to grow outward, accumulating detail and embellishment. In Sumer, the opposite sometimes occurs. The oldest versions of stories are often the briefest, the most restrained. Later retellings add drama, morality, and narrative comfort. The earliest layers feel cautious, almost reluctant, as if the act of remembering too much might invite repetition. This reluctance extends to cosmology. The heavens are mapped, but not celebrated. Stars are catalogued, but not romanticized. Celestial order is treated as something that must be tracked precisely, lest it drift into danger. Astronomical knowledge appears early and with startling accuracy, suggesting long-term observation across generations. Such continuity requires stability, or at least the memory of stability once lost. The language reflects this tension. Certain grammatical constructions imply that the present is not the default state of the world, but a temporary condition. Words for balance and measure appear frequently, paired with warnings about excess and neglect. The implication is subtle but persistent. Things fall apart when attention lapses. This is not the language of a people discovering their place in the cosmos for the first time. It is the language of caretakers, of inheritors tasked with maintaining something fragile, of survivors who know that collapse is not hypothetical. Modern analysis often fragments these observations into separate disciplines. Linguistics here, mythology there, archaeology somewhere else. But the Sumerians did not experience their world in fragments. Language, ritual, and memory were one system, and that system appears oriented toward recovery, not origin. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its traces may not survive as monuments or machines. They may survive as habits of speech, as grammatical assumptions, as unspoken rules about how the will behaves when it is left unattended. Languages are conservative. They preserve structures long after the reasons for them are forgotten. In this sense, Sumerian may be less a beginning than a fossil, a linguistic imprint left by a prior age whose material remains have been erased by time, water, or deliberate forgetting. And if the deepest memory of that age could only survive as fragments embedded in grammar, then perhaps it was never meant to be remembered fully. Perhaps forgetting was part of survival, but forgetting is never complete. It leaves pressure points, irregularities, moments where the story hesitates. The Sumerian language hesitates often, and in those hesitations one can sense the outline of something immense, receding just beyond the reach of words. A past that no longer had a voice of its own, but still whispered through the syntax of those who came after. If language itself carries the echo of a lost world, then the question is no longer what happened before the Anunnaki arrived, but how much of that world still speaks through us, unrecognized, untranslated, and waiting for the moment when we finally pause long enough to hear it. The tension hidden in language finds a heavier form when it settles into numbers, not casual numbers, not poetic exaggerations, but figures carved into clay with care and repetition. The Sumerian king list is one of the most unsettling documents to survive from the ancient world, not because it tells us who ruled, but because of how time behaves within it. The list does not open gently. It does not ease the reader into history. It begins at a scale that feels almost inhuman. Kings reign for tens of thousands of years. 8 rulers before the flood govern for a combined span that stretches far beyond what biology allows, far beyond what metaphor alone can comfortably explain. These are not gods, at least not explicitly. They are kings. They rule cities with recognizable names, places that would later exist again in diminished form. And then, with no elaboration, the list pauses. The flood comes, everything resets. After this rupture, time collapses. Reigns shorten dramatically. Hundreds of years become decades. The world becomes smaller, faster, more fragile. The list continues, orderly and precise, as if nothing unusual has occurred. Yet everything has changed. This contrast is often dismissed as symbolic. But symbolism is rarely arbitrary. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. Their administrative texts tracked grain, labor, and livestock with relentless precision. They did not confuse categories lightly. When they chose to open their history with impossible durations, they were not careless, they were deliberate. The question is not whether these reigns were literal in the modern sense. The question is what kind of memory demands such scale to express itself. Long reigns may encode more than time, they may encode stability, environmental constancy, a world that did not force rapid adaptation, a world where change was slow enough to be measured in generations that never seemed to end. Then something interrupts this continuity. Flood myths appear in many cultures, but in Sumer they feel less mythic and more procedural. The flood is not framed as a moral cleansing. It is a threshold, a before and after. The list does not dwell on destruction. It marks transition. Kingship descends again. Cities are re-established. History resumes, but diminished. Geological records suggest that ancient Mesopotamia was no stranger to catastrophic flooding. The convergence of the Tigris and Euphrates, combined with post-glacial sea level rise, would have produced repeated, devastating inundations. Entire settlements could vanish beneath silt within a single generation. Memory would fracture. Survivors would rebuild on higher ground, carrying stories too large for detail. But the king list suggests something deeper than local disaster. The scale of the rupture feels global in its implications. Time itself behaves differently afterward. The world no longer permits extended reigns. Something about the environment, the sky, or the relationship between humanity and the divine is altered. The Anunnaki appear in this context not as initiators, but as regulators. After the flood, their presence becomes more pronounced. Roles are formalized, duties are assigned. The cosmos is reorganized into manageable domains. It is as though the world has proven itself too unstable to be left ungoverned. One begins to wonder whether the long reigns before the flood refer not to individual lifespans, but to something broader. Dynastic continuity, cycles of stewardship, periods of equilibrium measured in ways no longer accessible to later humans. When that equilibrium fails, time accelerates, history becomes compressed, memory shortens. Modern discomfort with these numbers reveals something about us as well. We prefer beginnings that resemble ourselves. We trust timelines that fit within our biological expectations. Anything that stretches beyond them feels threatening, not because it is false, but because it destabilizes our sense of place. Yet the Sumerians did not share this discomfort. They recorded the long reigns without apology. They did not explain them away. They placed them at the very start, as if to say that whatever came later could only be understood in relation to what had been lost. The king list is not mythology masquerading as history. It is history refusing to be simplified. It acknowledges a depth of time that cannot be reconciled easily with later experience, and rather than smoothing that contradiction, it preserves it. This preservation matters. It suggests that the Sumerians did not see themselves as the pinnacle of a linear ascent. They saw themselves as living in the aftermath of something greater. Their kings ruled not with divine confidence, but with inherited burden. Authority was no longer eternal, it was conditional. The flood in this sense is less a punishment than a boundary, a moment when the rules of the world changed, when longevity gave way to fragility, when memory had to be condensed into ritual and list, because lived continuity was no longer possible. If something existed before the Anunnaki, the king list may be one of the few places where its shadow still folds clearly, not as description, but as distortion. Time stretched until it broke, then reassembled in smaller pieces, and if time itself was altered by whatever catastrophe lies behind the flood, then the arrival of the Anunnaki may have been a response to that alteration. An intervention aimed not at creation, but at containment. The list does not tell us what the world was like before the break. It only tells us that it was different enough to require an entirely new way of living afterward. And perhaps that is all it could tell. For those who compiled it, the past beyond the flood was not a place to return to. It was a reference point, a reminder of scale, a warning encoded in numbers too large to ignore yet too distant to fully comprehend. The king list ends where human memory can function again, where reigns can be counted in years that resemble our own. Everything before that remains deliberately disproportionate, as if the Sumerians wanted to ensure that no one would ever mistake their world for the first. And if they were right, then the true beginning of human history may not lie at the start of the list at all, but somewhere far beyond it, where time was once wide enough to hold what we can now only remember as impossibility. After the long reigns fracture and time contracts, memory turns toward water, not as metaphor alone, but as force. In the Sumerian imagination, floods are not distant legends told for comfort or moral instruction. They are close, they are practical, they are remembered with a kind of restraint that suggests familiarity rather than awe. The flood appears not as a beginning, but as an interruption already assumed. It is mentioned almost casually in some texts, as if its reality required no embellishment. The world before it is not described in detail, perhaps because detail had become dangerous. What matters is that it happened, that it divided time, and that everything afterward must be understood as provisional. Unlike later traditions that moralize the flood as divine punishment, Sumerian versions feel quieter. The gods debate. They disagree. Some attempt to warn, others enforce silence. The catastrophe unfolds not as righteous cleansing but as administrative failure, a system overloaded, a balance misjudged, a decision made too late to reverse. This subtlety matters. Moral myths simplify trauma. Procedural myths preserve it. Geological evidence does not contradict this restraint. At the end of the last ice age, meltwater pulses raised sea levels rapidly and unpredictably. River systems destabilized. coastal plains vanished. In regions like southern Mesopotamia, flooding would not have been singular, but repeated, compounding, erasing layers of habitation again and again. A people who survived this would not mythologize water lightly. The flood, then, becomes less a story than a scar. It is the line no one crosses backward. Everything before it becomes inaccessible, not because it is forbidden, but because it is gone. Language falters there. Narrative thins. Only outlines remain. The Anunnaki's role sharpens in the wake of this loss. After the flood, their authority intensifies. They assign domains with greater urgency. They formalize hierarchies. The world requires tighter management now. Floodplains must be controlled. Human behavior must be regulated. Memory must be curated. This is not the behavior of creators at ease with their work. It is the behavior of custodians responding to collapse. There is a haunting implication embedded here. If the flood erased more than settlements, if it erased an entire mode of living, then the Anunnaki's arrival may have coincided not with humanity's birth, but with humanity's second attempt. A restart constrained by lessons learned too painfully to forget, but too incompletely to explain. Flood narratives often function as containers for collective trauma. They allow cultures to carry forward knowledge of vulnerability without reliving every detail. But in Sumer, the flood feels less symbolic than logistical. It resets kingship. It redraws borders. It shortens memory. It changes how time itself is experienced. Before the flood, reigns stretch beyond comprehension. After it, everything accelerates. Lives shorten. Records multiply. Bureaucracy expands. Writing becomes essential, not ornamental. When memory can no longer rely on continuity, it must be externalized. Clay becomes the new archive. And yet, even as writing preserves the after, it cannot recover the before. The flood marks the moment when explanation gives way to management. The world no longer asks why it exists. It asks how to endure. In this context, the Anunnaki appear not as distant gods, but as embedded administrators of a damaged system. They are not worshipped for their creativity, but respected for their oversight. Their punishments are feared because instability is feared. Chaos is not abstract. It has already happened once. Modern retellings often strip the flood of this intimacy. They turn it into spectacle. But for the Sumerians, water was not a metaphor for divine wrath. It was an existential constant. The land itself could vanish overnight. Stability required vigilance, and vigilance required hierarchy. Perhaps this is why Sumerian religion feels heavy. There is little ecstasy, little promise of salvation. The gods are not saviors. They are enforcers of order in a world that has proven its willingness to collapse without warning. The flood does not end the story. It narrows it. It forces history into channels as constrained as the rivers themselves. Everything afterward flows faster, with less room to meander. If something existed before the Anunnaki, the flood may be the reason it no longer speaks clearly. Water erases gently, persistently, leaving no sharp edges to trace. It dissolves monuments. It rearranges soil. It carries away evidence without malice. What remains after such erasure is not nothing. It is caution. It is ritual. It is a worldview shaped by loss rather than hope. The Sumerians did not ask whether the flood would happen again. They assumed it could. Their entire civilization was built around preventing repetition, not understanding origins. And if the Anunnaki arrived in response to a world reshaped by water, then their true significance may lie not in what they created, but in what they were trying to keep from happening again. The flood, then, is not merely a mythic event buried in the past. It is the silent partner in every Sumerian decision. a reminder that beneath order lies instability, and beneath memory lies erasure. What came before the flood may be unreachable, but the fear of its return shaped everything that followed. And if fear can build civilizations, then perhaps the deepest foundation of history is not creation, but remembrance of collapse, quietly guiding hands that no longer remember what they once lost, only that it must never be lost again. After water redraws the land, the sky becomes the next archive. When the ground can no longer be trusted to hold memory, attention lifts upward, toward patterns that seem immune to flood and erosion. In Sumerian thought, the heavens are not a place of escape or transcendence. They are a reference system, a ledger, a reminder that order exists somewhere beyond the reach of rivers. Yet even here something feels misaligned. The Sumerians observed the sky with care that feels excessive for a people, supposedly at the dawn of civilization. They tracked planetary motions, recorded eclipses, and aligned temples with celestial events that require long-term observation to recognize. This is often described as genius. But genius does not explain duration. Precision of this kind requires continuity across generations. It requires records inherited, not improvised. More unsettling still is the way Sumerian cosmology speaks of the heavens as already structured. Constellations are named as if long familiar. The paths of planets are described as duties rather than discoveries. Stars do not emerge into significance. They are assigned roles, and these roles imply a prior framework, one that existed before the surviving records began. Some of the star groupings referenced in early texts no longer align with the sky as we see it today. Precession of the equinoxes slowly shifts the apparent position of stars over millennia, altering which constellations rise and set at certain times of year. A civilization attentive to this would notice change only over very long spans of time. The fact that Sumerian astronomy appears already adjusted to such cycles raises a quiet question. How long had they been watching? Or perhaps, how long had someone else been watching before them? The gods themselves are mapped onto the sky. Anu claims the highest heaven. Enlil governs the air and storms. Enki descends into the deep. These are not abstract domains. They correspond to observable layers of reality. A vault of stars, the shifting atmosphere, the hidden waters beneath the earth. The heavens mirror a world already understood as stratified and fragile. This cosmology does not feel exploratory. It feels conservative, as if its primary goal is not to expand knowledge, but to preserve alignment. When alignment fails, catastrophe follows. Floods, famine, disorder. The sky becomes a warning system. If something existed before the Anunnaki, traces of it may survive in this anxiety about misalignment. The fear is not of ignorance, but of forgetting how things are supposed to be arranged. Later, civilizations often treat astronomy as a tool for prophecy or divination. In Sumer, it feels closer to maintenance. Celestial omens are not mystical riddles. They are alerts, signals that something in the system has shifted. The universe is not sending messages, it is showing symptoms. This perspective implies experience. One does not build an entire worldview around vigilance, unless vigilance has once failed catastrophically. There is also the matter of scale. Sumerian timekeeping extends far beyond human lifespans. Their calendars are interwoven with cycles that span decades, centuries, and longer. This is not practical for daily life alone. It suggests an inherited obligation to track long patterns, even when individual observers will not live to see their completion. Why would such responsibility exist unless continuity had once been broken? The Anunnaki's relationship to the sky reinforces this. They do not create the heavens. They regulate them. They enforce boundaries. They punish transgression. Their authority is vertical, descending from above, but their function is stabilizing. They ensure that the layers of the cosmos remain in their proper places. This emphasis on vertical order may reflect memory of a time when those layers collapsed into each other, when water rose into land, when sky fell into storm, when distinctions blurred and survival depended on re-establishing separation. Archaeology offers no direct confirmation of such cosmic trauma, but it does not need to. Cultures encode memory symbolically when literal preservation fails. Myths of sky and earth once joined, then separated, appear across the ancient world. In Sumer, these myths are not celebratory, they are cautionary. The heavens are beautiful, but they are also dangerous. They must be watched. There is a quiet loneliness in this worldview. The sky is not a source of comfort, it is a reminder of responsibility. Humans are not children of the cosmos, they are caretakers living beneath it, aware that its order is not guaranteed. If the world before the Anunnaki experienced a collapse that blurred these cosmic boundaries, then the post-flood emphasis on celestial regulation makes sense. Stability had to be reasserted from above, because it could no longer be trusted to arise naturally. The stars that become witnesses rather than guides, they have seen too much to be romanticized. Modern observers often marvel at ancient astronomy, without asking what compelled such attention. We praise alignment and calculation as achievements, but achievement is rarely the whole story. Sometimes it is the residue of fear, refined into discipline. The Sumerians did not look to the sky to imagine the future. They looked to it to prevent repetition. If something existed before their gods arrived, something that fell out of alignment with the cosmos, then the sky would be the only place where that memory could remain relatively untouched. Ground erodes, water forgets, but stars endure long enough to become anchors for collective anxiety. And so the heavens hover over the earliest civilization not as a promise, but as a burden, a silent record of order regained at great cost. If the Anunnaki came after a collapse that affected not just the land but humanity's relationship to the cosmos itself, then their legacy may be less about creation and more about constraint, teaching humans where not to reach, what not to forget, how carefully the layers of the world must be kept apart. The sky still turns above us, indifferent and precise, but beneath its motions lies an older question, one the Sumerians seemed unwilling to ask directly. What happens when even the heavens are no longer safe from forgetting? When the figures known as the Apkallu enter the Sumerian memory, they do so without spectacle. They are not announced as creators, nor celebrated as conquerors. They appear quietly, already formed, already knowing what must be taught. 7 of them are remembered most clearly, though later traditions blur their number. They are described as sages, as bearers of wisdom, as intermediaries between gods and humans, but there is something unusual about their role. They do not introduce novelty, they restore continuity. The Apkallu arrive after disorder. Their teachings are practical rather than visionary. They instruct humans in building cities, maintaining temples, observing the heavens, recording knowledge, and honoring boundaries. This is not the curriculum of a newly awakened species. It is the syllabus of a society recovering from rupture. They teach how to live within limits, how to preserve what remains, how to remember without reopening wounds. In iconography, the Apkallu are often depicted as hybrid beings, part human, part animal, sometimes cloaked in fish skins. This imagery has been interpreted in many ways. Some see symbolic fertility, others see ritual costume, but symbols persist because they carry emotional weight. The fish in particular invites attention. It is a creature of water, yet capable of surviving beneath pressure. To wear its form is to acknowledge a relationship with the flood, not as conqueror, but as survivor. The Apkallu are not said to have created humanity. That task belongs elsewhere in the mythic framework. Instead, they're positioned as teachers who arrive once humans already exist, confused, scattered, and vulnerable. Their presence suggests a second phase of civilization, one focused on stabilization rather than emergence. Later traditions describe some Apkallu as antediluvian, existing before the flood, while others appear afterward. This distinction is rarely emphasized, but it matters. It implies continuity across catastrophe. Knowledge did not vanish entirely. It crossed the boundary in fragments, embodied in figures who could carry it forward without explaining its origin. This is a familiar pattern in cultures shaped by trauma. Survivors transmit practices without recounting the full story. Skills are preserved, reasons are simplified, memory becomes procedural. The Apkallu function in this way. They are vessels of inheritance, not narrators of origin. The Anunnaki's relationship to the Apkallu is telling. The sages do not challenge divine authority. They operate beneath it, translating cosmic order into human behavior. They are mediators, not rivals. This suggests that whatever knowledge they carried was already compatible with the post-flood world. Dangerous truths may have been left behind. There's also an undercurrent of anxiety surrounding the Apkallu in later texts. Some traditions warn that their wisdom can become disruptive if misused. Knowledge, once separated from its original context, can destabilize rather than support. This fear hints at the possibility that certain understandings were intentionally limited, filtered, or ritualized to prevent recurrence of earlier disasters. If something existed before the Anunnaki, the Apkallu may represent its final echo. Not the civilization itself, but its residue. The distilled lessons extracted from a world that no longer exists. Lessons stripped of explanation, retained only as instruction. Archaeologically, the sudden appearance of complex urban planning, standardized construction, and administrative systems aligns with this narrative. These developments do not unfold gradually. They appear as if guided by a template already tested. The Apkallu, then, are less mythic beings than mythic explanations for inherited structure. Modern scholarship often treats them as symbolic personifications of priestly classes or cultural memory. This may be accurate, but it does not exhaust their significance. Symbols arise where language fails. The Apkallu may be how the Sumerians spoke about continuity without confronting loss directly. They embody the idea that knowledge can survive collapse if it is carried carefully, quietly, without insisting on recognition. There is also the matter of their disappearance. The Apkallu do not persist indefinitely. They withdraw. Their role diminishes as human institutions mature. This suggests that their function was transitional. Once stability is re-established, direct mediation is no longer necessary. Memory can be managed internally, but the withdrawal also raises questions. What happens to knowledge once its carriers are gone? How much is retained? How much is reshaped to fit new conditions? How much is forgotten because it no longer feels relevant? The Sumerians did not preserve stories of the Apkallu's origins. They preserved their functions. This selective memory reinforces the idea that origins were either unknown or intentionally left unspoken. What mattered was not where wisdom came from, but how it could be used safely. If the world before the Anunnaki ended in catastrophe, then wisdom from that world would be dangerous if misunderstood. It would need to be encoded, ritualized, simplified. The Apkallu may be the form that encoding took. There is a quiet humility in this approach. No claims of mastery, no declarations of enlightenment, only the careful transmission of what is necessary to endure. In this light, the Sumerian reverence for tradition begins to make sense. Innovation is not celebrated. Continuity is. Change is approached cautiously. The past is not idealized, but it is respected as something too powerful to recreate fully. The Apkallu stand at the threshold between memory and forgetting. They remind humanity that survival sometimes depends not on knowing everything, but on knowing just enough. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its shadow may linger not in monuments or myths of glory, but in these restrained figures who taught humanity how to live smaller lives in a diminished world. And if that is true, then the greatest inheritance of ancient civilization may not be knowledge of how to build, but knowledge of how to stop building before everything collapses again. The sages fade from view, leaving behind systems, rituals, and habits that outlast them. What they do not leave behind is explanation. And perhaps that absence is deliberate, because some truths, once spoken plainly, are too heavy to survive intact. As the sages recede into memory, the language remains, not as a neutral tool but as a landscape shaped by pressures long past. Words endure when buildings fail. Grammar survives where monuments sink. And in the Sumerian tongue, there are fractures that feel older than the texts themselves. Certain terms appear fully formed, resistant to analysis. They do not decompose into smaller units. They have no clear ancestry within the language. Linguists note them as anomalies, as lexical fossils whose origins cannot be traced. These words cluster around ideas of authority, cosmic order, ritual obligation, and boundary. They are not decorative. They sit at the structural core of how reality is described. This is unsettling. Languages typically evolve outward, layering meaning through time. But here, meaning appears already layered, already burdened. As if the speakers inherited not just words, but responsibilities attached to them. Consider how Sumerian handles causality. Actions are often framed as responses rather than initiatives. Events occur because something was neglected, or because a balance was disturbed. The grammar leans toward consequence. This subtle emphasis suggests a worldview trained to look backward for causes, not forward for innovation. The present is always adjusting to something that has already gone wrong. There are also words that describe states of disorder without specifying their origin. Chaos is assumed, not explained. The language seems comfortable naming aftermath without narrating cause. This is not ignorance, it is restraint. When causes are too vast or too dangerous to revisit, cultures learn to speak around them. The isolation of Sumerian as a language deepens this impression. It stands alone, with no confirmed relatives. This is often treated as an academic puzzle, but isolation can also result from erasure. Languages vanish when their speakers vanish. If Sumerian preserved fragments of a broader linguistic ecosystem that collapsed, then its isolation would be the natural outcome of survival rather than emergence. Borrowed words from neighboring languages appear later, but the core remains resistant. It does not absorb easily. It maintains its internal logic with remarkable discipline. This suggests a language stabilized early under conditions that discouraged rapid change. Stability is rarely the product of peace alone. It can also arise from necessity. There are moments in the text where the language hesitates. Sentences bend around concepts they cannot fully articulate. Pronouns blur. Agency becomes diffuse. It is unclear who initiates action and who merely responds. These ambiguities are often dismissed as translation difficulty. But ambiguity itself can be meaningful. It can signal discomfort with assigning blame or credit in situations where causality is overwhelming. Mythic narratives in Sumer frequently avoid definitive explanations. They circle events, describing their effects from multiple angles without committing to a single cause. This pattern mirrors the language's structure. It favors implication over declaration, suggestion over assertion. Such habits do not arise spontaneously. They're cultivated. If the world before the Anunnaki ended abruptly, leaving survivors with incomplete understanding, then language would become a place to store what could not be safely confronted. Words would carry weight without unpacking it. Meaning would be preserved in outline, not detail. There's also the matter of taboo. Certain names are avoided or spoken indirectly. Certain acts are referenced obliquely. This is not unique to Sumer, but it is pronounced. The unsayable often corresponds to the unrememberable. Language learns to protect itself by limiting access. In later Mesopotamian traditions, some of these linguistic patterns persist even as myths grow more elaborate. This suggests that the restraint was inherited, not invented. Once embedded, it became invisible, simply the way things were said. Modern readers often search these texts for hidden messages, coded revelations waiting to be decoded. But the code may not be intentional, it may be structural. A language shaped by loss will encode that loss without announcing it. It will teach speakers how to think without telling them why. This has implications beyond Sumer. If our earliest written language was already conditioned by catastrophe, then the foundations of recorded history may be narrower than we assume. Writing begins not at the dawn of innocence, but at the edge of forgetting. The Anunnaki's authority is reinforced by this linguistic environment. Their commands are absolute, their decrees final. There is little space for negotiation. This rigidity suggests a system designed to prevent deviation. Flexibility had proven dangerous. Ambiguity had consequences. Order had to be enforced, not discovered. Language in this context becomes a tool of containment. It limits what can be asked. It channels thought along safe pathways. It preserves continuity by discouraging exploration of the deepest past. This does not imply malice, it implies survival. When later cultures inherit Sumerian concepts, they often simplify them. They attach narratives where Sumerian texts left gaps. They moralize where Sumerian language merely records. In doing so, they lose some of the original tension, the sense that something is being held back. Yet traces remain. In the way time is discussed, in the way gods are approached with caution rather than devotion, in the way history begins abruptly and refuses to explain itself. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its most durable legacy may not be architectural myth, but a linguistic posture, a way of speaking that assumes fragility, that treats memory as something to be managed carefully. We often imagine ancient languages as simpler than our own, but simplicity can be deceptive. What appears simple may be compressed. What appears primitive may be disciplined by experience we no longer share. The Sumerian language does not shout its secrets. It whispers them through structure, through habit, through what it chooses not to say. And perhaps that is fitting, because a world that has already ended once would not announce itself loudly. It would survive quietly, embedded in the way people speak, think, and remember, without knowing why. If language is a fossil record of consciousness, then Sumerian preserves the imprint of a mind shaped by loss too ancient to be named. And the question that lingers is not whether we can translate the words, but whether we can listen to the silence that shaped them, without rushing to fill it with answers we are not ready to carry. Beneath the language, beneath the myths, beneath even the earliest memories etched into clay, there is another kind of silence. It lies in the ground itself. Archaeology, for all its precision, often encounters moments where the earth refuses to speak, not gradually, not ambiguously, but abruptly, as if a page has been torn from the record and the soil beneath it carefully smoothed over. In southern Mesopotamia, the earliest cities rise with astonishing confidence. Streets are planned, canals are engineered. Administrative buildings appear already optimized for control and storage. This sudden sophistication has long been explained as the natural outcome of agricultural surplus. Yet surplus alone does not account for coherence. It does not explain why systems emerge already standardized, already interconnected, already dependent on abstract coordination. What lies beneath these first cities is often thinner than expected. Excavations descend through occupational layers that should taper gently into simplicity. Instead, they encounter sterile deposits, flood silts, or long stretches of relative emptiness. There are gaps where experimentation should be, where crude attempt should precede refinement, where failure should leave traces, but these traces are missing. Floods are frequently invoked as explanation, and they are certainly part of the story. Water erases, silt buries, but floods do not discriminate. They scatter debris, they preserve fragments in unexpected places. Complete absence is harder to account for. The deeper one digs, the more the question shifts. It is no longer why Sumer rose so quickly, but why the ground beneath it appears so selectively quiet. This pattern is not unique to Mesopotamia. Across the ancient world, early civilizations often appear atop layers that feel insufficient to explain what follows. In some places, excavation simply stops, not because nothing lies beneath, but because nothing recognizable does. The tools of interpretation falter. The soil resists narrative. Modern archaeology is constrained by what it expects to find. Stone tools, hearths, burials, pottery. But what if earlier societies organized themselves differently? What if their material culture was vulnerable to water, decay, or deliberate removal? What if permanence was not valued in the same way? The Sumerians themselves built in mud brick, a material chosen for availability, not longevity. It requires constant maintenance. It dissolves back into earth when neglected. If a civilization before them relied even more heavily on such materials, its disappearance would leave little behind. There is also the uncomfortable possibility of intentional erasure, not in the sense of conspiracy, but of practicality. Survivors rebuild using what remains. They clear unstable ground. They repurpose debris. They do not preserve ruins for posterity. They need space to live. If the world before the Anunnaki ended in catastrophe, the first priority afterward would not be remembrance. It would be stabilization, clearing land, redirecting water, establishing new centers of control away from danger. In such conditions, older layers would be disturbed, flattened, or buried without ceremony. The absence beneath Sumer may therefore reflect success rather than failure, a thorough reset. This idea aligns with the tone of Sumerian memory. The past before the flood is not revered as a golden age. It is avoided, referenced obliquely, treated as something too unstable to dwell upon. Archaeological silence mirrors narrative silence. There are moments when artifacts appear out of place, anomalous in technique or style, then vanish from the record. These are often dismissed as trade items or local variation. But anomalies matter. They hint at complexity without continuity. At knowledge that flickers briefly then disappears. Underwater archaeology adds another layer of uncertainty. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, submerging vast coastal regions where early human activity would have concentrated. If advanced societies existed in these now lost landscapes, their remains would lie far beyond the reach of traditional excavation. This possibility is rarely emphasized, not because it lacks evidence, but because it lacks access. What cannot be easily studied is often set aside. The Anunnaki's arrival in this context coincides with a shift in settlement patterns. Cities cluster along managed waterways. Agriculture becomes regimented. Labor is organized. The land is disciplined. This suggests a conscious response to instability. A desire to impose order where chaos once reigned. Archaeology records this order clearly. What it struggles to record is what necessitated it. There is a tendency in modern thought to equate absence with insignificance. If something left no trace, it is assumed to have been small, simple, or non-existent. But absence can also be the result of thoroughness, of systems designed to collapse cleanly, of materials chosen for impermanence, of decisions made under pressure to prioritize survival over memory. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this fragility. Their obsession with record-keeping emerges alongside their awareness of loss. Writing becomes not a celebration of presence, but a defense against disappearance. Clay tablets are small, redundant, replaceable. They do not aspire to eternity. They aspire to continuity. If something existed before the Anunnaki, it may have failed precisely because it trusted continuity too much. It may have built in ways that assumed stability. When stability vanished, so did its record. What remains now is not evidence of absence, but evidence of caution. The ground beneath Sumer is quiet because quiet was necessary. Archaeology often seeks spectacle, monuments, walls, graves. But some histories do not want to be found. They dissolve intentionally, leaving behind systems rather than structures, habits rather than objects, instructions rather than explanations. In this sense, the silence beneath Sumer is not empty. It is dense with implication. It suggests that whatever came before did not want to be remembered in the same way, or perhaps could not be. The earth does not lie, but it does forget selectively. It preserves what resists it and absorbs what yields. If an earlier world yielded easily, its memory would survive only where resistance was built later. The Anunnaki inherit this silence. They do not attempt to fill it with monuments to the past. They establish new ones oriented toward control, regulation, and repetition. They accept the erasure as final, and so the ground beneath the first cities remains smooth, patient, uninformative. It offers no clear contradiction, no dramatic revelation. Only a refusal to support the idea that civilization began gently, step by step in that place. Perhaps the most honest thing the soil can say is nothing at all, because sometimes the absence of evidence is not an invitation to imagine freely, but a reminder that something ended so completely that even its debris was no longer safe to keep. And if that is true, then the foundations of human history may rest not on beginnings, but on deliberate forgetting, pressed into the earth until it became indistinguishable from the ground itself. When the silence beneath one civilization begins to feel deliberate, attention naturally drifts outward, not to escape the question, but to test its weight. If something profound was lost before the Anunnaki, if Sumer itself rose in the aftermath of erasure, then traces of that loss should not belong to Mesopotamia alone. Memory, even when fragmented, rarely confines itself to a single shoreline. Across distant cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, similar patterns emerge. Not identical stories, but familiar shapes. Ages that end abruptly. Worlds that reset. Knowledge that survives catastrophe only through intermediaries. These are not tales of heroic beginnings. They are stories of recovery, told by societies that seem aware, sometimes dimly, sometimes with painful clarity, that they are not living in the first version of the world. In many ancient traditions, time does not move forward cleanly. It loops, it collapses. It begins again with less than it had before. Earlier ages are described as longer, more stable, closer to the divine. Later ages shrink. Lifespans shorten. Memory fades. This structure appears in places that never shared language or trade. Its persistence suggests experience rather than coincidence. Floods recur, not as isolated myths, but as markers of transition. Fire, too, appears in some traditions, not as invention, but as cleansing force. The details vary, but the rhythm remains. A world grows complex, a boundary is crossed, order fails. Survivors rebuild under stricter rules. What is rarely described is the moment just before collapse. That moment seems inaccessible everywhere. Cultures remember what followed, not what caused it. This selective memory is revealing. It implies that the cause was either too vast to grasp or too dangerous to articulate. In some traditions, the beings who guide humanity after catastrophe are not creators, but teachers. They arrive suddenly, they impart skills, they withdraw. Their origins are ambiguous. They are sometimes said to come from the sky, sometimes from the sea, sometimes from a place no longer reachable. They do not linger to explain themselves. This pattern echoes the Apkarlu. It echoes the Anunnaki's administrative presence. It suggests a shared strategy of survival. Knowledge must be transmitted. Origins must remain obscured. Comparative mythology is often treated cautiously for this reason. Similarities invite speculation that unsettles comfortable timelines. It is easier to assume independent invention than shared memory of loss. Yet independent invention does not easily explain why so many cultures remember not beginnings, but endings. The idea of successive ages appears again and again, each age marked by decline from the one before, each transition accompanied by catastrophe, each rebirth constrained by new limits. This is not a story of progress, it is a story of containment. If something existed before the Anunnaki, perhaps it existed before many of the figures remembered as civilizing forces. Perhaps it was not localized. Perhaps it was a mode of living, a relationship to the world rather than a single empire. When that mode failed, fragments of its knowledge scattered, carried by survivors into different regions, reshaped by necessity. Over time, those fragments would lose their common reference point. What began as shared experience would harden into separate myths. The cores would be forgotten, a pattern would remain. Modern scholarship often seeks to strip these stories of their emotional content, reducing them to allegory or environmental response. Floods become metaphors, teachers become personifications, ages become moral frameworks. These interpretations are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They explain how stories function, not why they recur with such insistence. There is a difference between metaphor chosen freely and metaphor inherited under pressure. One of the most striking features of these global narratives is their restraint. They do not celebrate the lost age. They do not attempt to reconstruct it in detail. Instead, they warn. They emphasize humility. They caution against overreach. Knowledge is treated as dangerous if misapplied. This caution suggests memory of consequence. The Anunnaki's role within Sumeria fits this broader pattern. They are not benevolent guides ushering humanity toward greatness. They are overseers ensuring compliance with a new order. Their authority reflects a world that can no longer tolerate experimentation at scale. If similar figures appear elsewhere under different names, their shared function may matter more than their differences. They arrive after disaster. They teach limits, they enforce boundaries, they withdraw once systems stabilize. What they do not do is explain what came before. This absence of explanation may be intentional. Survivors often protect future generations by withholding stories that could destabilize them. Trauma that cannot be integrated becomes taboo. It survives indirectly, shaping behavior without being named. The recurrence of these patterns across cultures suggests that humanity's deep past may not be a single line of ascent, but a series of recoveries. Each recovery narrower than the last, each memory more compressed. If so, then the Anunnaki were not unique. They were one expression of a broader response to collapse, a response that prioritized order over truth, continuity over understanding. This perspective does not require a lost supercivilization in the way imagination often demands. It requires only that humans once organized themselves differently, at a scale or in an environment that proved unsustainable. When that organization failed, what remained was not technology but caution. Caution travels well, caution. It survives translation. It embeds itself in myth, law, and ritual. It teaches people how to live without telling them why. As these myths spread and diverge, their common origin becomes harder to see. Each culture adapts the pattern to its own landscape. Flood becomes fire, sky becomes underworld, teachers become gods, the structure persists. The Sumerians, writing earlier than most, preserve a version of this pattern close to its source. Their restraint is sharper, their silence is more pronounced. They do not romanticize what was lost. They do not attempt to retrieve it. They organize themselves around its absence. In this sense, Sumer may not be exceptional for what it remembers, but for what it refuses to invent. It leaves the deepest past unadorned, unreachable, marked only by scale and rupture. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its memory may be global, fragmented into myths that no longer recognize each other. Each culture holds a shard shaped by its own survival. The question, then, is not whether these stories point to a single event or civilization, but whether they reflect a shared human experience of loss so ancient that it can no longer be localized. And if that is the case, then the silence beneath Sumer is not unique. It is simply one of the earliest places where forgetting became structured enough to leave a trace. What remains is not a map back to the beginning, but a warning repeated in many voices, across many lands, telling humanity the same thing in different words. The world has ended before, and it may do so again, if the reasons for its earlier endings remain unexamined, unspoken, and misunderstood, hidden not because they are false, but because they are too heavy to carry without changing everything that follows. As stories scatter across cultures, another thread binds them quietly together. It is not myth or language this time, but rhythm. A slow, impersonal rhythm that does not belong to humans at all. It belongs to the sky's movement over centuries, to the subtle wobble of the earth, to cycles so long they exceed any single lifetime. The Sumerians, attentive as they were to the heavens, seemed acutely aware of this rhythm, even if they never spoke of it directly. Time, in their records, is not simply counted. It is layered. The motion of the stars changes almost imperceptibly, yet over thousands of years those changes accumulate. Constellations drift, equinoxes shift. What once rose at dawn no longer does. A culture attentive to this would need patience, continuity, and inherited observation. One generation alone could never notice the full pattern. The knowledge would have to be passed forward carefully, preserved against interruption. An interruption, by all accounts, had already occurred. Sumerian astronomy does not feel experimental. It feels corrective. Measurements are refined, cycles are tracked, irregularities are noted. The sky is treated as something that must be monitored to prevent error. This vigilance implies prior misalignment, not curiosity, but responsibility. Precession of the equinoxes was not named as such, but its effects were embedded in observation. Star calendars had to be adjusted. Ritual timings shifted. Sacred alignments required recalibration. These are subtle responses to a deep truth. The cosmos does not remain fixed, and human systems that assume it does will eventually fail. If a civilization before the Anunnaki aligned itself too rigidly to a celestial order, it assumed to be permanent, then gradual cosmic drift could have devastating consequences. Agricultural cycles could slip, flood seasons could change, navigation could fail. Over generations, small errors would compound into systemic collapse. This possibility rarely appears in myth because it lacks drama. There is no single moment of punishment, no divine decree. Only the slow realization that the world no longer behaves as expected, that trusted patterns no longer hold. Such a collapse would be difficult to narrate, easier to remember the aftermath than the cause. The Sumerians seem to inherit this awareness. Their cosmology emphasizes balance, measure, and adjustment. Timekeeping is meticulous. Festivals are regulated. Omens are scrutinized. The universe is not static. It requires constant recalibration. The Anunnaki's authority fits neatly into this framework. They are enforcers of order in a universe that drifts. Their decrees stabilize human systems against cosmic indifference. They are not creators of harmony, but managers of misalignment. Long cycles also appear in the way Sumerians conceptualize ages. There is no optimism about endless improvement. Instead, there is resignation. Ages decline, conditions worsen. The best that can be hoped for is maintenance, not ascent. This perspective contrasts sharply with later historical narratives that emphasize progress. It suggests that the earliest literate culture did not see itself as advancing into the future, but holding the line against decay. If something existed before the Anunnaki, perhaps it failed because it underestimated time. Not time as sequence, but time as drift. Civilizations may rise quickly, but they are tested slowly, tested by changes too subtle to notice until they are irreversible. Ice core data and climate studies reveal that Earth systems are capable of abrupt shifts following long periods of apparent stability. Temperature, precipitation, and sea levels can change rapidly once thresholds are crossed. For a society deeply dependent on predictable cycles, such shifts would be catastrophic. The Sumerians did not articulate this scientifically, but their caution suggests experiential knowledge. Their myths encode not just disaster, but delayed consequence. The flood arrives not as surprise, but as culmination. If earlier humans misread the sky, mistook long-term drift for permanence, then catastrophe would feel inexplicable. Divine anger would be a convenient language for what was actually systemic misalignment. After such a failure, survivors would approach time differently. They would track it obsessively. They would embed caution into ritual. They would fear deviation. This is precisely what we see. The Anunnaki's world is one where limits matter, where boundaries between sky, earth, and water must be enforced, where transgression leads to instability. This is not arbitrary morality. It is ecological memory. Modern observers often assume that ancient peoples lacked awareness of deep time. But awareness does not require equations. It requires continuity of observation and the humility to notice change without understanding its cause fully. The Sumerians possessed this humility. They did not claim mastery over the cosmos. They accepted their vulnerability within it. Their gods were not omnipotent. They were constrained by larger forces. Fate itself could not always be overturned. This acceptance suggests a worldview forged in the aftermath of failure, a recognition that intelligence alone does not guarantee survival. That alignment with the world's deeper rhythms matters more than our ingenuity. If something existed before the Anunnaki, it may have been brilliant, ambitious, and unsustainable. Its collapse would not leave monuments, only lessons encoded in fear and restraint. The long cycles of the sky continue regardless of belief. They outlast languages, cities, and gods. To build without accounting for them is to build briefly. The Sumerians seem to understand this. Their civilization does not boast of eternity. It documents fragility. It tracks time because time is the enemy of assumption. As the heavens slowly shifted above them, they wrote, measured, and ritualized, not to conquer the cosmos, but to remain aligned with it for as long as possible. Perhaps this is the quiet inheritance left by a forgotten age. Not technology, not power, but awareness of scale. Awareness that the world changes in ways that cannot be negotiated. And if the Anunnaki arrived in response to a civilization that failed to respect these cycles, then their legacy is not mystery, but warning. The stars still drift. The cycles still turn. Humanity still builds as if the present will hold. The question is not whether ancient people knew less than we do, but whether they knew something we're only beginning to remember again. That survival depends not on dominating time, but on listening to it, before it moves just far enough out of alignment to make remembering impossible once more. As attention shifts from the sky back to the earth, another pattern emerges, one that is slower, heavier, and more difficult to mythologize. It is the pattern of a reset. Not renewal in the hopeful sense, but reset as constraint, a narrowing of possibility after failure, a well that continues but only within tighter margins. In the deep layers of ice and sediment, modern science has uncovered a truth that resonates quietly with ancient restraint. Earth's climate does not always change gradually. It can lurch. It can cross thresholds beyond which recovery takes unfamiliar forms. Long periods of relative stability can end suddenly, replaced by conditions that force rapid adaptation or extinction. For societies dependent on predictable seasons, such shifts would feel indistinguishable from divine intervention. The Sumerians lived in a land shaped by extremes. River systems that nourished their fields could just as easily destroy them. A slight change in rainfall upstream could mean abundance or starvation downstream. Their civilization balanced constantly at the edge of viability. This precariousness was not theoretical, it was lived. If a prior world existed, one less constrained, more expansive, it may have done so under climatic conditions that no longer prevailed. When those conditions changed, the structures built upon them would fail regardless of ingenuity. Collapse would not be moral, it would be mechanical. In this light, the idea of a reset becomes less mystical and more inevitable. The Sumerians seem to have inherited this inevitability as worldview. Their myths do not promise restoration of what was lost. They assume that loss defines the present. The goal is not to return to an earlier state, but to endure within this diminished one. Kingship after the flood is no longer eternal. It is temporary, conditional, revocable. Authority becomes something to manage carefully rather than embody permanently. This shift reflects an understanding that systems must be flexible enough to survive change, but rigid enough to prevent chaos. The Anunnaki's role fits neatly into this logic. They are not symbols of boundless power, they are symbols of limit. Each governs a domain, each has constraints. Even divine authority is distributed to prevent concentration. This fragmentation of power suggests memory of what happens when too much rests in one place. Resets leave psychological residue. Survivors internalize caution. They mistrust excess. They ritualize restraint. Over time, these habits harden into culture. What began as emergency response becomes tradition. This process can be observed even within the archaeological record. Early Sumerian cities emphasized standardization. Brick sizes are uniform. Measurements are regulated. Labor is organized hierarchically. These features are often praised as evidence of sophistication. But they are also evidence of fear of deviation, fear of improvisation, fear that small errors will accumulate into catastrophe. If a civilization before the Anunnaki collapsed because its systems grew too complex, too interconnected, too ambitious, then simplification would be the natural response. Reduce variability, control flow, limit growth, accept constraint as safety. The concept of fate in Sumerian thought reflects this. Fate is not destiny in the romantic sense. It is a boundary, a recognition that certain outcomes cannot be avoided once conditions are set. Fate is what happens when systems reach their limits. The gods themselves are subject to fate. This is rarely emphasized, but it matters. It suggests a worldview in which even divine actors operate within larger forces, forces that cannot be negotiated with, only accommodated. Such humility rarely arises in cultures that feel ascendant. It arises in cultures that have witnessed collapse. If something existed before the Anunnaki, it may have been defined by confidence, by belief in continuity, by assumption that success would persist. Its failure would have taught survivors that confidence is dangerous. The reset, then, is not a single event. It is a shift in consciousness, a narrowing of imagination, a recalibration of expectation. This recalibration is visible in the way Sumerian texts treat the future. There is no promise of endless improvement. Progress is not assumed. Instead, there is vigilance. The future is something to be managed cautiously, not celebrated. Modern narratives often struggle with this perspective. We prefer stories of ascent. We frame collapse as aberration. But for much of human history, collapse has been the rule, not the exception. What varies is scale. The Sumerians may have been among the first to write from within a post-collapse world. Their texts carry the tone of those who know that survival is conditional. That memory must be curated, that forgetting can be fatal. The Anunnaki's authority reinforces this condition. They're invoked not for inspiration, but for enforcement. They punish excess. They restore balance. They intervene when boundaries are crossed. Their presence is a reminder that freedom without limit leads back to chaos. If this sounds oppressive, it is because safety often is. After disaster, freedom becomes secondary to stability. Exploration yields to consolidation. Innovation is permitted only within strict bounds. This is not decadence, it is adaptation. The idea of reset challenges modern assumptions about civilization. It suggests that complexity does not accumulate endlessly. It rises, peaks, and then must be pared back to survive. Each cycle leaves residue in culture, shaping what comes next. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its most enduring legacy may be this residue, a worldview that treats existence as provisional, that values continuity over expansion, that understands loss as foundational rather than exceptional. The Sumerians did not romanticize this condition, they accepted it. Their rituals seek favor, not transformation. Their myths warn, not promise. Their gods maintain order, not create paradise. The reset is never described directly because it does not need to be. It is present everywhere. In the fear of flood, in the regulation of labor, in the careful tracking of time, in the refusal to imagine unlimited futures. What came before may have imagined such futures. That imagination may have been its undoing. And so history continues, not as a straight line, but as a series of constrained recoveries, each shaped by the memory of the last failure, each quieter than the one before. If we listen carefully, the Sumerian world whispers this lesson without insisting upon it. Survival is not triumph, it is compromise. The question that lingers is not whether resets have happened before, but whether they are happening still, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of systems that once again assume permanence, and whether we, like those before us, will recognize the narrowing of possibility as warning, or mistake it for stability, right up until the moment when adjustment is no longer enough. After reset comes remembrance, but remembrance is never neutral. What survives does so because someone decides it should. In Sumer, memory was not left to chance. It was gathered, shaped, and housed within institutions that understood the danger of forgetting and the equal danger of remembering too much. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were vaults, repositories of ritual, record, and rhythm. Within their walls, time was organized, offerings measured, and knowledge repeated until it hardened into habit. This repetition was not devotional excess. It was a method of stabilization. What is repeated survives. What is neglected dissolves. Priesthoods emerged as custodians of this repetition. Their role was not to innovate, but to preserve alignment between the human world and the cosmic order. They memorized lists, recited names, recalibrated calendars. Their authority derived not from revelation, but from consistency. They remembered so others could function without remembering. This division matters. When memory becomes institutional, it also becomes selective. Certain narratives are reinforced, others fade, not because they are false, but because they are destabilizing. The deepest past, the world before the flood, before the Anunnaki, remains present only as outline. Its details are not elaborated, its causes are not debated, it is acknowledged, then bracketed. Institutions do this instinctively. They filter, they simplify, they protect continuity by reducing complexity. In a post-collapse society, this filtering is not censorship, it is survival. The Sumerian temple economy reflects this mentality. Resources are redistributed centrally. Labor is assigned. Surplus is stored. Nothing is left unmanaged. This level of control is often described as administrative brilliance. But brilliance can arise from necessity as easily as from vision. If something existed before the Anunnaki that failed because it lacked such control, then the institutionalization of memory would be a direct response. Knowledge could no longer roam freely. It had to be anchored. Writing itself becomes part of this anchoring. Early cuneiform is pragmatic. It records transactions, inventories, obligations. Only later does it expand into literature and myth. This progression suggests that writing was initially a tool for regulation, not expression. What does not serve regulation is less likely to be written down. The Anunnaki's presence within these institutions reinforces hierarchy. They are invoked to legitimize authority. Decrees are framed as divine. This is not manipulation in the modern sense. It is alignment. Human systems borrow the stability of cosmic order by mirroring it. But mirroring requires simplification. The cosmos is complex. Institutions cannot be. They must reduce, categorize, standardize. In doing so, they inevitably distort. Memory, once institutionalized, becomes memory of memory, a second-order reflection. Each repetition moves it further from lived experience. Over generations, the original event becomes abstract, its emotional charge diffused into ritual. This diffusion is visible in how later texts treat the flood. It becomes a story with moral framing, a lesson rather than a wound. By the time it is retold elsewhere, its procedural nature is softened. Its terror is domesticated. This process is not deceitful. It is human. Raw trauma cannot be transmitted indefinitely without harming those who receive it. Institutions exist in part to soften inheritance, yet softening has consequences. When causes are forgotten, patterns repeat. The Sumerians seemed aware of this risk. Their emphasis on ritual precision, on correct timing, on exact repetition, suggests anxiety about drift. If memory fades too much, alignment fails. If alignment fails, catastrophe returns. This fear underlies the conservatism of Sumerian culture. Innovation is slow, change is incremental, authority is respected, not because rebellion is unthinkable, but because disorder is remembered as existential threat. Modern perspectives often misinterpret this conservatism as stagnation. But stagnation implies comfort. Sumerian restraint feels vigilant, not complacent. It is the vigilance of those who know what happens when systems unravel. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its memory may have been too volatile to preserve directly. Institutions would therefore preserve only what was necessary to prevent recurrence. The rest would be allowed to fade. This selective forgetting is not erasure. It is compression, a way of storing immense experience in manageable form. Over time, compression becomes opacity. Later generations inherit rituals without context. They perform alignments without understanding why. They obeyed boundaries whose original purpose has been lost. At this point, myth steps in. Myth provides narrative where memory has thinned. It fills gaps with meaning that feels coherent, even if it is not historically precise. This is not deception. It is adaptation. The Anunnaki, within myth, grow larger than their original function. They become creators, judges, cosmic architects. Their administrative role expands into metaphysical authority. This expansion reflects not historical reality, but the needs of a culture seeking explanation where memory no longer suffices. Yet beneath the mythic elaboration, the institutional habits remain. The focus on balance, the fear of excess, the acceptance of limit. These persist because they are functional. If the world before the Anunnaki collapsed because its institutions failed to manage complexity, then Suma's institutions represent a corrective experiment, one that prioritizes endurance over expansion. The cost of this experiment is imagination. The future becomes narrower. Possibility is constrained. The past becomes unreachable, but survival continues. As centuries pass, these institutions harden. What began as response becomes tradition. What was once adaptive becomes dogma. Eventually, the original reasons vanish entirely. At that point, memory has completed its transformation. It no longer remembers the collapse. It remembers only the rules designed to prevent it. This is where history begins to feel like origin rather than aftermath. When the scaffolding outlasts the building it once supported, the Sumerians stand at this threshold, early enough to remember loss, late enough to institutionalize it. Their texts hover between trauma and tradition, between silence and structure. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its final trace may not be found in stories of glory or power, but in the careful architecture of remembrance that refuses to speak its name. Institutions remember what individuals cannot, but they also forget what no longer fits, and so the deepest past remains sealed, not behind walls of secrecy, but beneath layers of function, doing its work invisibly, shaping behavior without explanation. The question that remains is whether such forgetting is a failure or a necessity, because a civilization that remembers too much may not survive long enough to become history at all. As institutions harden and memory thins, discomfort begins to surface elsewhere, not in myth or ritual, but in the way later scholars approach the past. There is a subtle resistance that emerges when timelines grow too deep. When continuity fractures instead of flows, it is not denial. It is unease, a sense that certain questions, if followed too far, would undermine the frameworks used to understand everything else. This discomfort is not unique to the modern world. It appears whenever inherited systems of knowledge encounter evidence that suggests interruption rather than progression. The idea that civilization rises, falls, and rises again is manageable. The idea that it resets under forces not fully understood is less so. It destabilizes narratives of mastery. Sumer, standing at the threshold of recorded history, poses this problem acutely. It is old enough to feel foundational, yet young enough to remember collapse. For later cultures and later scholars, this ambiguity is troubling. It resists clean categorization. It refuses to behave like a beginning. As writing spread beyond Mesopotamia, histories grew more confident. Origin stories became clearer, more moralized, more purposeful. Causes were named. Lessons were drawn. The world was framed as intelligible. In comparison, Sumerian restraint feels almost evasive. Modern historiography often mirrors this preference for clarity. It seeks linear development, incremental improvement, traceable ancestry. When confronted with gaps, it fills them cautiously, often defaulting to simplicity rather than complexity. This is no error, it is method. But method shapes what can be seen. The deeper one looks into early Sumer, the more the method strains. Writing appears suddenly. Mathematics arrives already abstract. Astronomy is already systematized. These are not the expected features of a nascent culture. They look like inheritance. To acknowledge inheritance without origin is to admit that something important is missing. And missing things are difficult to manage within academic frameworks built on evidence and continuity. This is where discomfort turns into boundary. Certain hypotheses are explored tentatively, then set aside. Certain questions are reframed until they no longer threaten structure. The flood becomes local, the long rains become symbolic, the silences become accidents of preservation. These explanations are reasonable, they're often correct in part, but they also serve a function. They protect the coherence of the historical narrative. Every system of knowledge has limits beyond which it becomes unstable. To question whether Sumer was a recovery rather than a beginning pushes against those limits. It's just that the true origin of complex society may lie beyond the reach of writing itself. That recorded history begins after something has already ended. This suggestion does not sit easily with disciplines that rely on texts as primary anchors. If the most transformative events occurred before writing, then writing becomes not a record of beginnings, but a symptom of loss. A technology developed to compensate for fractured continuity. Such a perspective alters the meaning of literacy itself. Writing ceases to be a triumphant milestone and becomes a defensive adaptation. A way to externalize memory when living transmission can no longer be trusted. The Sumerians may have understood this intuitively. Their early texts are lists, ledgers, measurements. They do not narrate the past expansively. They constrain it. They reduce it to what can be managed. Later cultures, inheriting writing without the trauma that necessitated it, reinterpret it as expression rather than containment. History becomes story. Story becomes identity. Identity becomes certainty. In this process, Sumer's ambiguities are smoothed over. Its hesitations are reframed as naivety. Its silences are filled with assumptions. The possibility that it stood on the ruins of an earlier world fades into the background, replaced by the comfort of origin. Yet traces of discomfort remain. They appear in debates about diffusion versus independent invention, in arguments over anomalous artifacts, in reluctance to integrate geological timescales fully into cultural history, in the quiet separation between prehistory and history, as if the two were fundamentally different rather than contiguous. Prehistory by definition lacks text. It is treated as mute, primitive, incomplete. But perhaps it is not mute. Perhaps it simply speaks a language we no longer prioritize, one written in collapse, adaptation, and selective survival. If something existed before the Anunnaki, Its absence from text would not indicate insignificance. It would indicate that writing emerged after its failure, not during its flourishing. The survivors would write not to celebrate what was, but to prevent what happened from happening again. This reframing challenges deeply held assumptions. It suggests that progress is not inevitable, that knowledge does not accumulate endlessly, that civilization can forget as easily as it learns. These are uncomfortable ideas, particularly in cultures that define themselves by advancement. The Sumerians did not define themselves this way. Their texts do not proclaim destiny. They do not promise redemption. They accept limitation as condition. This acceptance may be the most radical aspect of their legacy. Modern discomfort with deep antiquity often masks a deeper fear. If civilizations can rise and fall without leaving clear traces, then our own permanence is illusory. If knowledge can be lost so thoroughly that only habits remain, then mastery is temporary. To acknowledge this would require humility. It would require rethinking history not as ascent, but as oscillation, not as accumulation, but as negotiation with forces larger than the intention. The Anunnaki seen through this lens are not gods to be decoded, but symbols of that negotiation. They represent order imposed after failure, authority constrained by necessity, power exercised not to expand, but to stabilize. This interpretation does not require belief in hidden empires or suppressed technologies. It requires only attention to pattern, to the repeated emergence of complex systems after catastrophe, to the consistent narrowing of possibility following collapse. Suma's legacy, then, is not the invention of civilization, but the documentation of its limits, a record of how humans learn to live with the knowledge that the world does not guarantee continuity. The discomfort this generates in later scholarship is understandable. It threatens narratives of progress and control. But discomfort is not error. It is signal. If the past refuses to behave like a foundation, perhaps it is because it is not one. Perhaps it is a fault line, running beneath history, occasionally surfacing as myth, silence, or unease. To study Suma honestly is to stand on that fault line and resist the urge to smooth it over. The question is not whether history can accommodate such instability. The question is whether we can. Because if civilization begins not with triumph but with recovery, then the measure of success is not how high we build, but how carefully we remember why the last stretches fell, before forgetting once again feel safe enough to mistake for progress. If Sumeria was not the beginning, then inheritance becomes the central question. Not inheritance of land or blood, but inheritance of condition. What does it mean to receive a world already shaped by failure, already narrowed by caution, already oriented towards survival rather than possibility? The Sumerians appear to have understood themselves this way. Their identity is not forged through conquest of an unknown future, but through careful management of a fragile present. They inherit systems rather than invent them. They maintain order rather than pursue expansion. Their greatness, if it can be called that, lies in endurance. This endurance comes at a cost. When a civilization inherits a diminished world, imagination must be restrained, curiosity must be guided, excess becomes dangerous. The memory of collapse, whether consciously remembered or not, casts a long shadow. It teaches restraint even when restraint no longer feels necessary. If something existed before the Anunnaki, and if Sumer rose in its aftermath, then humanity's first recorded civilization is already a compromise, already operating within limits imposed by past failure, already shaped by a lesson learned too deeply to forget. This reframes the meaning of first civilization. It is not first in sequence, it is first in documentation. First to write after forgetting became necessary. First to record the world not as it was imagined, but as it had to be managed. Later civilizations inherit this posture without always understanding it. They inherit laws, measurements, cosmologies, and rituals stripped of their original urgency. What was once survival becomes tradition. What was once caution becomes authority. Over time, these inherited structures are mistaken for natural order. The Anunnaki, transformed through retelling, become creators rather than caretakers. Their administrative functions inflate into acts of genesis. The memory of collapse recedes. The inheritance is reinterpreted as origin. This reinterpretation is comforting. It allows civilizations to see themselves as ascending rather than stabilizing. It replaces vigilance with confidence. It reframes limits as challenges to overcome rather than boundaries to respect. Yet the structures themselves still carry the imprint of their origin. Hierarchies remain rigid. Rituals remain precise. Time remains something to be measured carefully. Fate remains inescapable. These are not the features of a culture intoxicated by possibility. They are the features of a culture shaped by loss. If Sumer inherited a world already constrained, then humanity's long arc may not be a story of steady improvement, but of gradual forgetting of why those constraints existed. Each generation inherits systems without inheriting their context. Over time, caution feels arbitrary. Limits feel oppressive. Memory thins. This thinning creates space for repetition. When limits are challenged without understanding why they were imposed, systems destabilize. Complexity grows unchecked. Confidence replaces humility. Eventually, conditions resemble those that preceded earlier collapse. The cycle tightens. The Sumerians seem to have sensed this danger. Their myths warn against overreach. Their gods punish hubris. Their stories emphasize balance. These themes are often moralized by later cultures, but in Sumer they feel practical. Less about virtue, more about consequence. If something existed before the Anunnaki that fell because it exceeded its capacity to manage itself, then the lesson embedded in Sumerian culture is clear. Survival requires knowing when to stop. This is a difficult inheritance. It demands restraint in the face of potential. It values continuity over transformation. It accepts that some doors, once closed by catastrophe, should not be reopened lightly. Modern sensibilities struggle with this message. We prefer narratives of liberation. We frame limits as temporary obstacles. We assume that knowledge inevitably leads to control. But the Sumerian worldview suggests the opposite. That knowledge without humility accelerates collapse. That control is always partial. That the world is not obliged to remain stable simply because we understand it better. If Sumer stands at the beginning of recorded history, but not the beginning of civilization itself, then writing becomes a boundary marker. It marks the point at which humanity begins to remember selectively, to curate its past, to organize memory in ways that support survival rather than truth. This does not diminish writing's importance, it complicates it. Writing becomes less a celebration of consciousness and more a response to fragility, a way to externalize what can no longer be trusted to continuity alone. The Anunnaki, as figures within this framework, are not mysterious visitors to be decoded, but symbols of this externalization. They embody authority that exists beyond any individual, rules that do not depend on memory, limits that persist even when their reasons fade. To inherit such a system is to inherit both protection and constraint. It keeps civilization stable, but it also narrows the range of possible futures. Over time, that narrowing may feel suffocating. Pressure builds. The temptation to transcend the limits grows. This tension lies at the heart of human history. The desire to expand versus the need to endure. The urge to rediscover lost potential versus the fear of repeating catastrophe. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its greatest gift to humanity may not have been knowledge, but warning. A warning encoded not in clear narratives, but in structures designed to outlast understanding. The tragedy is that warnings fade. They require renewal to remain effective. When memory becomes ritual without context, its power diminishes. What was once a safeguard becomes habit. Habit becomes burden. Burden invites rebellion. This is not failure, it is cycle. Sumer may represent the first turn of that cycle visible to us, a civilization consciously limiting itself to avoid repetition. Later civilizations loosen those limits, reinterpreting inheritance as origin. Eventually conditions align once more for collapse. The question is not whether this cycle can be broken, it is whether it can be recognized. Recognition requires humility. It requires accepting that our achievements may rest on foundations built in response to earlier failures, that our confidence may be inherited, not earned, that progress may be conditional rather than guaranteed. The Sumerians lived with this awareness. The texts do not ask how far humanity can go. They ask how long it can remain. If we inherit their world, and we do, we also inherit their dilemma, whether to treat the past as a story of ascent or as a record of recovery, whether to honor limits or challenge them blindly. The answer is not written plainly anywhere. It never was. What remains is the quiet implication that the first civilization we remember was already living after an ending. And if that is true, then our own position in history may be less secure than we imagine. Not because collapse is inevitable, but because forgetting is. Forgetting why the world is arranged as it is. Forgetting the cost of rebuilding. Forgetting that survival once required choosing less, not more. If Sumer inherited a world shaped by failure, and if we inherit Sumer's systems without its caution, then the question is no longer what happened before the Anunnaki arrived. The question becomes whether we are now approaching the point where someone else, somewhere in the future, will ask what existed before us and why it ended. When the trail of memory finally thins beyond language, beyond institution, beyond myth, what remains is not an answer but a posture, a way of standing in the world, a quiet awareness that history is not a foundation laid once, but a surface walked repeatedly, worn thin in places where too much weight has passed before. The Sumerians seem to inhabit this awareness without naming it. The texts do not resolve the tension between beginning and aftermath. They allow it to remain unresolved. The world, as they describe it, is not young, it is tired, not in despair but in experience. It has endured enough to know that certainty is dangerous. What existed before the Anunnaki never steps fully into view. It does not need to. Its absence is its signature. Like a coastline reshaped by storms whose names are no longer remembered, the shape of what is missing still governs how everything else is arranged. Perhaps that is the nature of the deepest past. It does not announce itself. It shapes behavior long after explanation has faded. It teaches caution without revealing its lesson. It leaves behind systems designed not to recreate what was lost, but to prevent its loss from happening again. In this sense, the ancient world speaks not in revelations, but in constraints. The Sumerian universe is one of limits carefully observed. Gods are powerful yet bound. Kings rule, yet briefly. Knowledge exists, yet must be managed. Time moves forward, yet always carries the weight of interruption. Nothing is allowed to grow unchecked. This is not pessimism. It is realism born of memory too old to narrate. Modern eyes often search ancient texts for secrets, for hidden technologies, for evidence of forgotten greatness. But the deeper message may be simpler and heavier. That greatness, once achieved, does not guarantee survival. that complexity can become liability, that knowledge without humility accelerates fragility. If something existed before the Anunnaki, it may have possessed brilliance beyond what we imagine. It may have mapped the sky, mastered the land, organized itself in ways that felt permanent, and then permanence failed. What followed was not darkness, but reduction. A smaller world, a quieter ambition, a civilization that chose to remember selectively in order to endure. Writing begins here, not as triumph, but as tool, a way to hold together what continuity could no longer sustain, a way to stabilize memory in a world where living transmission had been broken. From this perspective, history does not begin with light. It begins with dimness carefully arranged so that life can continue within it. The Anunnaki, viewed through this lens, are not intruders or creators. They are expressions of structure imposed after collapse. They represent rules that no longer depend on understanding, boundaries that persist even when reasons are forgotten. Such boundaries are both protective and suffocating. They keep chaos at bay, but they also limit imagination. Over time, those limits feel arbitrary. Pressure builds. Humanity forgets why restraint mattered. This forgetting is not moral failure. It is natural. Memory erodes. Success breeds confidence. Confidence breeds risk. Risk accumulates quietly until systems strain once more. The Sumerians lived close enough to a prior ending to feel this tension constantly. Their world is vigilant, restrained, heavy with implication. They do not dream loudly of futures. They attend carefully to the present. Later civilizations, further removed from that ending, reinterpret inheritance as origin. They mistake scaffolding for foundation. They forget that the rules were built in response to disaster, not discovery. In doing so, they repeat an ancient pattern: expansion without memory, innovation without restraint, complexity without humility. The past does not punish this. It does not intervene, it waits. What remains after all the texts are read and all the theories considered is not certainty, but resonance, a sense that humanity has stood here before, that questions of origin are less important than questions of endurance, that the most dangerous moment in any civilization is not its beginning, but the moment it forgets why it began the way it did. If something existed before the Anunnaki, its final legacy may not be hidden knowledge waiting to be recovered. It may be the quiet architecture of caution embedded in the earliest systems we inherited. A warning not encoded in words but in limits. Limits on growth, limits on power, limits on certainty. We live in an age that distrusts limits. We frame them as obstacles to overcome rather than signals to heed. We search the past for permission to expand further, faster, higher. We rarely ask whether the past is warning us to slow down. The Sumerians did not ask how much the world could hold. They asked how easily it could break. That question echoes faintly through their myths, their lists, their silences. It does not demand an answer. It demands attention. History, when listened to closely, does not offer comfort. It offers proportion. It reminds us how small our moment is compared to the forces that shape it. How often civilizations have mistaken stability for permanence. The world before the Anunnaki may never be recovered. Its names may be gone, its structures dissolved, its reasons forgotten. But its shadow remains in the way the first civilization chose restraint over ambition. That shadow stretches forward, touching every culture that followed, including our own. The question is not whether humanity began once or many times. It is whether we recognize the signs of narrowing possibility when they appear, whether we treat silence as absence or as warning, whether we understand that forgetting is not neutral. Somewhere beneath the layers of history, beneath language and soil and myth, there is a memory not of greatness but of consequence. It does not ask to be believed. It does not need to be proven. It only waits. And perhaps the deepest task of history is not to recover what was lost, but to notice when the patterns that preceded loss begin to reassemble quietly around us, disguised as confidence, disguised as progress, disguised as certainty, until once again, the world feels stable enough to forget why stability was ever fragile at all.